Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I encourage you to hit that like button, to subscribe for more quality content, and to share with your friends. I also encourage you to check out the playlist tab, and I also encourage you to check out my books. I will put the link to my author page in the description. If you like my content, be sure to hit that like button and to check out the other videos and to subscribe. I also encourage you to check out my books, as reading my books and even reviewing my books helps me a lot, and it allows me to continue to reach an audience and to grow my channel as well as my other artistic endeavors, so I very much appreciate that. And if you really want to support my channel, then I definitely encourage you to check out my books. Today I'm going to talk about Lucretius as part of my ongoing Philosopher series, so without further ado, let's dive right in. I am very excited today because I'm going to talk about Lucretius, who is a philosopher and poet from ancient Rome. And I'm going to talk about his book on the nature of the universe, which I'm very excited to be able to talk about. And so without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, Lucretius is an interesting philosopher. I believe him to be less cited than other philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle, but he definitely had a very interesting approach to philosophy, and he definitely fits in the lineage of philosophers while also contributing his new take and this new take of Lucretius, and I'm very excited to talk about these things. So first off, I wanted to make a distinction between poetry and philosophy, and so that includes talking about Lucretius's poem, because it is basically a poem, even if in some ways it is also a philosophical treatise. It is very important to acknowledge that Lucretius fit in the tradition of other philosophers I have talked about in my Philosopher series, such as Parmenides, as well as other philosophers, and he definitely is in line and engaged with what could be called philosophical poetry. And so there is a very formal quality to the words and to the structure that Lucretius chooses for his poem, but it is also still nonetheless a philosophical exposition. So the best way to describe this is there is the beauty of language and the beauty of form to be able to capture a certain creative kind of speculative mentality, but Lucretius is also doing his best to ground himself in the world, in the physical world that we are a part of, and so for this reason, he might be considered a materialist in some ways for capturing a more materialist view of the world and using science and exposition and evidence to be able to convey that approach. And so, in this way, it really is the best of both worlds. Lucretius is speculative, creative, imaginative, and he's using the poetic form to be able to capture these certain elements, while also utilizing a more scientific method or scientific approach by thinking about the physical world, by thinking about the implications of what we perceive and what we see, and by using logic and reason to be able to deduce certain opinions. Now, it's very interesting to think about Lucretius's actual ideas in terms of thinking about, I would describe, philosophy and science. Lucretius definitely talks about the notion of atoms as seeds, and I was very inspired by this idea because it seemed to me as though Lucretius was describing seeds, or the creative potential of matter, to be able to become what it is. A seed is a very interesting metaphor to use for such things as atoms, because it implies that there are things that are born from this seed, from this atom, and even though this view might be less scientific in some ways, because we see atoms as a much more mechanistic thing that leads to a very specific outcome for the world, it is very interesting to think about atoms as growing things in the world, and I really liked that idea. I'm not sure if that is exactly what Lucretius meant, but I like the idea of a seed as being something that has the data and quote unquote DNA of something that is able to flourish and blossom and become something beautiful in the world. And I really like this metaphor. To me, it captures some of the notions of teleology, which you would get from Aristotle, for example, and teleology of which is defined as a purpose of something. And it is very interesting to think about atoms as having a purpose as material things in the world and having encoded in them some kind of complicated structure or some kind of complicated way of being that leads to something in the world. And I find that to be very, very interesting. I definitely see the seed metaphor as a metaphor for potential and for something that exists in the world and that can become something. And so it might be a little bit abstract and it might be more metaphorical in a lot of ways, but it's still an interesting way of looking at things. Now, definitely, as you know, in philosophy, from watching some of my videos as an example, we would say that there are a lot of abstract notions and abstract principles that philosophers are trying to think about and discover. And one of the things that leads to an abstract notion for Lucretius is thinking about the universe and thinking about what the universe is. And so, to some degree, this is non-empirical, but it is still very logical. And I think that's an important thing to say, especially when describing how Lucretius's idea is that the universe is infinite, that the universe does expand forever. This is very interesting when thinking about Zeno's paradoxes, for example, and when thinking about Parmenides and the notion of the whole, of things being a whole rather than being parts. And this definitely goes into the metaphysics of our experience with the world and with the universe, which is so hard to fathom. But it's very interesting how Lucretius is able to think about the infinity of the universe, and he's able to postulate this. And this is a much more scientific principle that is utilized in modern science, and I think this is a very important idea to keep in mind. Infinity is a difficult thing to think about, but it is very interesting to think about how the universe does seem to have these unknown properties, and the best way that we can understand existence and the universe is by thinking of it as being infinite. So I find that to be very interesting. Now, one thing I wanted to note in this discussion of Lucretius and the continual interplay and dynamics between philosophy, poetry, and science, it is very interesting to think about how Lucretius really was taking a scientific approach with a lot of the things that he was describing in his book, because he was not only thinking about materialism and the physical material world, but he was also trying to look for evidence. And even if the book is poetic and it captures things in that vein, it is also very much capturing an idea of what the universe actually is. And so a good way to look at this is by thinking about the contrast between Lucretius's point of view and his methodology for writing his philosophy, and compare that to Plato. It does seem that Lucretius had a more logical view of the world because he didn't see Earth, as an example, as being the center of the universe. And this is a very important point to consider. While Plato's view was much more centered on the Earth as being the center of everything. And so I think in this way, this is how both Lucretius and Plato came to different views and came to different metaphysics. And I find that to be very interesting in a variety of ways. That Plato and Lucretius approach the world differently based off their perspective, based off their metaphysics, based off their view of what they think the world is. And so while Plato may have had more heightened and idealistic ideas of what everything was, Lucretius was very much trying to ground himself in the world, even if he was using abstract and even philosophical notions. And I think that this is interesting to point out, because one thing that you get out of philosophy and these intellectual thoughts and explorations is that how we identify our metaphysics definitely has a lot to do with how we look at the world. And so I'm very fascinated by these ideas. I will admit I had trouble understanding Lucretius for a variety of reasons. I found him to be complex, and certainly I didn't always understand all of his ideas. And I definitely think that it matters how philosophers come to their conclusions and how they look at the world. And I think that is very valuable. Now, one more concept that I wanted to hit with Lucretius was a very important concept in philosophy and in other disciplines, which is the contrast of determinism versus indeterminism. You could argue that the world and that the world of atoms, for an example, are very structured and that they are determined, that they lead to very specific outcomes and that they lead to very specific things that we see in the world, very specific structures. But there is also the notion of indeterminism, which focuses on the unpredictability of atoms, which focuses on the unpredictability of the world, and implies that cause and effect is not always the most important aspect, if even at all important, in the way that we analyze things like atoms or things in the physical world, certain processes and things like that. And I think that this is very important to consider that the world really is indeterministic in some ways, or at least we can understand the world as having some of those properties. I personally don't like the dichotomy of determinism versus indeterminism. Usually when thinkers are thinking about these concepts, they move in one direction or the other. I myself probably have a more moderate view on these things. I wouldn't assume that things are always chaos, but it is still very much important in our philosophy to identify the chaos that we do actually experience in the world and that seem to be going on in the world of atoms. I'm Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on Lucretius. I would say that Lucretius is influential in a variety of ways for bringing us closer to a scientific worldview, but I would also argue that there is still plenty of space for philosophical views, for more abstract views, for speculation, for poetry, for creativity, and I think it is very interesting to think about how Lucretius was able to have both of those views. He was able to have the creativity and the spontaneity of poetry while also working on a more scientific, rigorous argumentation and philosophical approach. And I think that that is very valuable. I think one of the things that I get out of Lucretius's approach is thinking a lot about how our ideas do not have to be so polarized or dichotomized, that there are different ways that we can engage with the world. And I think that that is very valuable. I hope that you enjoyed this talk, and I hope that you will check out my other videos. And thank you for watching. I'm Phoenix, and I will see you next time.